welcome back to another SegWeather video. And in this video, I'm going to be breaking down your fall 2026 official outlook on what to expect as we head towards the fall season. We have a lot to unpack. I'm sure a lot of you guys are definitely ready for fall. I am as well. It's definitely been a hot summer where I am, and I'm sure a lot of you guys are probably tired of the heat too. Some of you guys also probably tired of all the rainfall as well. There's some good news for a lot of you guys, and probably not so good news for some of you guys as well. So be prepared to hear that in this outlook. Now, with this video, I will dive into El Nino's effect as we head towards fall, as we definitely have quite a bit of impact in the footprint in the country as we head towards the fall season. And then looking at temperature and precipitation analog years for years that compare to this year with what to expect with the pattern, especially with temperature and precipitation throughout the course of the fall months. And then we'll have an official outlook on that as well. And then looking at severe weather, looking at September, October, November for what to expect in all 3 months as well, after diving into some analog years and then week dabbing into hurricane season as well. Now, this video will be very meteorology heavy, so if you're not a big fan of all the meteorology mumbo jumbo, you can click to the timestamps here in this video to get your official temperature outlook, your precipitation outlook, and your severe weather outlook here. Now, if you're still here, we're going to go ahead and continue with all the mumbo jumbo that we're going to be talking about with this outlook, starting off first and foremost with El Nino. As you know, we're in the midst of a strong El Nino. I'll show you how high of El Nino we are at right now, as it will surprise you. But currently looking at the status of El Nino as we head towards the fall months, as of the mid-August 2026 update, it does show us still looking at El Nino lasting well into February of this next year, so until February 2027, even as we get towards March and April of next year, it looks to remain quite strong. Looking at 95% chance in March, but by April, still at 80% chance of El Nino sticking around, which is quite significant, which does tell us that this El Nino will be very much long lasting. It will not be going anywhere anytime soon as we head towards then. So unfortunately, looking at long lasting impacts of this El Nino. Now, looking at the current graph as where El Nino is currently sitting at, it is sitting at 2.0, which puts it at the very strong El Nino threshold, which very few El Ninos reach. And unfortunately, now we're in cahoots with 1987, 2015, even 1982. All those years succeeded the 2.0 cap for a strong El Nino range, and unfortunately this year it's not stopping anytime soon, as according to our future models as we head towards September, October, and November, it does show us going into the 3.0 range, maybe even reaching 3.5 with some of these models, and even 4.0 with a couple of these other high-end models showing that being the case. I don't think we will get up there, but that's a possibility, as some of these models are trending upwards, and they have been over the last couple of months, as with this El Nino being quite fast developing and beating out the other El Ninos in terms of its intensity. As the way it is right now, it's already beaten out much of the other El Ninos minus 2015, which is the only one where temperatures were quite close to where it is right now. But I do think that by the time we get to October, we will have already beaten the record El Nino from 2015. So it's a high chance that by the time we get to October, this El Nino may reach 3.0. So we could come back in and be looking at strongest El Nino on record. So this is just some food for thought for what can happen, as that could be very much on the table. Now, as we head towards fall with El Nino, we do typically see a rapid split in conditions across the country. For example, let's say you had a wet and stormy summer in the Midwest. As we head towards fall, you may turn drier and much warmer. So looking at that potentially being the case, or let's say you're in Texas, it's been a hot, dry summer, such as where I am right now. It could flip to being wetter and stormier as we head towards the fall months. So definitely quite a bit of a transition with El Nino. And not only that, looking at severe weather tending to shift quite a bit with El Ninos, as well, as usually of an El Nino, we see this trend where severe weather will be in the north for the first month or so, and then it moves to the south as we head later on in the season, as some of the dynamics get displaced throughout the course of the season with El Nino. Now, with frost and freezes, they do tend to come later on in the season, as we do typically see a lot more warmer temperatures encompass much of the U.S. throughout the course of the three months from September, October, November. So looking at definitely milder conditions, but that does not mean that it's going to be warm all the time, as there'll still be some cooler periods, such as sometimes in October we get those 1 or 2 days, maybe a couple of weeks where it's a bit cooler, as that typically occurs with El Nino, but not anywhere near as crazy as with in a normal year where we see a big strong cold front coming in October and temperatures drop to at least like 42 degrees and let's say Wisconsin. Nothing like that. It's more of you have a coolish day for a while and then it gets a bit warmer. Kind of like that kind of vibe with El Nino, but definitely does not mean we'll not see any frost or freezes. It does mean that there's a lesser chance of that occurring throughout the course of the season. Now, as we jump into our analog years, as I'm sure you guys are probably waiting for, starting off with September, looking at 1987, 1997, and 2023. These were the 3 years that had the best scenarios for what to expect in terms of this September, with with it featuring a very warm upper plains into Midwest, with temperatures as much as 4 degrees above the actual average high for that time of year in September, and then for the South, also quite warm, with temperatures as much as 3 degrees above the average high in these 3 years combined, which does tell us, unfortunately, that summer sticks around a bit longer, especially across the South and for the upper plains, which does mean temperatures likely still in the 90s for a lot of these areas, maybe a couple days in the 80s, but mainly a lot of 90s, especially early on in the month. And then for the South, kind of same thing, pretty hot early on, and then kind of cooling down a bit towards the end of the month. Now with October, this is the one that was pretty frustrating, as looking at El Nino years, all of them put together, especially our stronger ones, a lot of them were very biased, with some of them showing very cold for much of the country and others showing a warm bias for much of the country. So unfortunately, it kind of didn't give me a good um, signal for what to expect for October. But there were a couple of years that kind of teetered towards an average. That'd be 1965 and 2015, which I do think best represents what we could see, where it would be quite warm across the west coast into the Rockies and into the plains, but out towards the east, looking at neutral conditions with maybe a below average signal for the northeast. So, looking at that being the case potentially for those areas as we head towards October, as we may get some cold fronts coming in a bit more frequently in October, excuse me, which will mean a lot of those cooler conditions kind of dominating at times for much of October. It doesn't mean it's going to be cooler than average most of the time in October, but it does mean that we'll see more periods of temperatures flip flopping at times throughout the course of the month. And now in November, luckily this one was straightforward, just like with September. Looking at 1987 again, 2009, and 2015, it did feature some pretty warm Novembers, especially across the upper plains, looking to be quite above average, as much as 8 degrees above the actual average. And then temperatures in the Midwest quite warm, up to 4 degrees above average, 2 degrees above average as we head out towards the southeast. So this tells us that November tends to be a bit warmer than average for a good chunk of the country, which is a good signal, especially for a lot of you guys who don't like cold weather. This is good news for you for November. It doesn't mean you'll get the chance to enjoy the warmth a bit more, especially with this being the case according to your analog years. Now, with this put together for the official outlook for September, I do think, yes, we're going to have a very warm time in the upper plains, especially with temperatures as much as 90 degrees if not higher for a lot of you guys up there. So looking at a very warm upper plains into the Midwest, and then the South, especially in Texas, looking quite warm as well. Not as warm as the plains, but definitely enough to be quite noticeable, as temperatures may even peak in 105 to 110 frame, especially early on in the month before this slowly start to wane towards the end of the month. So looking at that being the case, but overall rounding out to being hotter than average, especially in this area and again in the upper plains as well. And towards the East Coast, maybe a little signal over there, but not quite as significant. Meanwhile, everyone else looking at equal chances of both above average and below average temperatures for the month of September. Now, as we head into October, looking pretty warm out west, especially across southeastern Washington, Oregon, Idaho, southwestern parts of Montana, into Wyoming. Looking at that being the case, so looking at quite a bit of warm for you guys, but out towards Midwest, expecting temperatures to be closer towards average, so not a strong signal for you guys as you do expect those cold fronts to have impact on those temperatures, especially early on in the month. And then towards northeast, looking to be a bit cooler as well, looking at colder average conditions for most of the time up there, so we do expect it to remain quite cool at times for much of the month in that area. Now we move on to November, where we do expect it to be quite warm again for much of the upper plains into the Midwest. Temperatures probably reaching the 60s quite a bit in this area. Temperatures kind of same thing up here, maybe a couple 70s thrown in here as well, as we could get some 70-degree days in November, believe it or not, as that does occur with El Ninos as well. So we could see that be the case, especially in Minnesota. I would say Wisconsin, Illinois may even get in a couple 70-degree days, believe it or not, in November. So I'll be on the lookout for that potentially as we head towards then. But now with all the years put together, with September, October, November, looking at the CFS model, it is painting a good picture for what to expect, especially with those temperatures looking at much above average here in the upper plains to upper Midwest, and then above average from the Rockies towards the Midwest, and then slightly above average from, I would say, eastern Washington towards Texas, and then up here towards Midwest. I would argue definitely a bit slightly above average for you guys as well. And in the southwest towards the southern part of Texas, I would say closer towards average. So looking at a bit of a cooler fall for you guys overall, but elsewhere looking quite warm for your fall this year. Now, as you look towards our precipitation, especially starting off with September, it does look to be a bit wet, especially in the Midwest. I did pull out the years 1965, 1972, 1986, and 2015, and these are good matches for to expect as we head towards September. And unfortunately, yes, I did mention it. Midwest is sure some of you guys probably groaned when I mentioned that, as yes, it does mean more wet weather and stormy conditions. And looking at some early season fronts to feel severe potential, unfortunately, in those areas, which will mean, unfortunately, a lot of rainfall and perhaps some flooding potentially, especially in Iowa, Wisconsin, where you guys have been hit pretty hard this year. It does mean you guys will be in the bullseye for that to occur, unfortunately, again. So I'll be on high alert for that to occur in September. Meanwhile, the East Coast, Southeast, not too bad, looking below average rainfall for you guys. So looking at less rainy days, but also less hurricane impacts, as usually with the signal does tell us that hurricanes don't tend to impact the U.S. as much in September, although not yet zero, but still lower chance of that occurring overall for September. Now, for October, it's a bit different. We do see a shift in where precipitation is the greatest. That tends to occur towards the south, especially in Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Oklahoma. You guys see much wetter conditions as we head into October. Even the mid-Atlantic turns a bit wet. But then the West Coast, though, look at that. Below average conditions for rainfall, as much as down to um, I would say 5 inches below average for rainfall. So looking at quite a dry October, according to these analog years of 2002, 1986, 1972 being the main ones. This does kind of verify this, with that potentially being the case as we head towards October. There could be some severe weather, but it's not exactly um, organized, as usually with that transition, you tend to get a break from the severe weather, meaning that severe weather isn't as widespread with El Nino Octobers, but it doesn't mean that's not there, as you can still get to smaller end events, especially in the deep south. And then as we head towards November, Kind of pulled a lot of years out for this: 1968, 1972, 1982, 1987, and 2002. These are all years that had the same analogs, and it does look a bit like October, but it's not quite October, as the difference is it's quite wet here in the Southwest, and then also quite wet in the Mid South. Southeast is also a bit wet, and around the interior Northeast also quite a bit wet as well. So looking at more of those wetter conditions overall throughout the course of the month. The Pacific Northwest remains quite dry though. Look at that, very dry in November, especially for the western part of Washington. So it does mean less systems moving through those areas. But with November though, especially with this uptick in rainfall in parts of eastern Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana, it does mean an increase in severe weather potential. As you'll see this in my severe weather analogs once I get to it. Unfortunately, it's not good news for those areas with November, as you do see that it does mean a lot of rainfall for them as well. And now with the rainfall look put together, looking at September, you guessed it, Midwest will be the bullseye with lots of rainfall expected as we head throughout the course of the month, especially in Wisconsin. You guys are looking to be in the bullseye for a lot of this. So, looking at definitely quite a bit of rainfall headed your way for September. Unfortunately, some severe weather thrown in there as well. And in October, looking at a shift again towards the south, looking at rainfall above average from Arizona towards Mississippi, and then a couple small areas here in Tennessee Valley, and also here towards Washington, D.C. as well. Meanwhile, the west coast around Washington looking a bit drier than average with those conditions. And then November, same thing for Washington and Oregon, a bit drier than average, although more widespread. And then a bit wetter towards southwestern portions of California into even western parts of California too. And in the mid south, also quite a bit wet as well. Southeast, seeing a bit of wet weather too, even into the mid Atlantic, looking to be a bit wet, and even up here towards New York City, turning a bit wet in November as well. And then with the models, at least with the CFS model, this one tends to be a bit more bullish, as it did kind of get it wrong with the way things are expected to fall. But again, this is just a model. But I do think we'll definitely be wet here in the Mid South to the Southeast, and definitely maybe a couple above average signals here in parts of the Rockies, as well as it could be wet at times. The Pacific Northwest, would disagree with this analog. I do think will definitely be drier than average for a lot of these areas. Midwest, I would say closer towards average with the rainfall, considering that September we're going to get all the rainfall and then we'll flip quickly towards average by the end of the season, and then definitely a bit more wetter towards Pennsylvania and even New York, even as we head again later into the season as well. Now we move on to severe weather, as this is also another component towards this outlook. Starting off in September, looking at tornadoes, as this is also an indicator for where that severe weather tends to be. Now, with starting off of our very strong El Nino year of 2015, you can tell that this year wasn't that active. We did have a couple tornadoes that occurred in parts of the Midwest towards the plains, and even here towards the southeast. Wherever you see the light blue, that's an EF0. The dark blues are EF1s, and the yellows for EF2s. You can tell that it wasn't quite an active year, but still quite a few tornadoes that impacted the Midwest. It just tells you that 2015 with a very strong Union wasn't that bad. Now we move on to 1987. Similar situation. A couple tornadoes up here in parts of Minnesota, but an EF3 struck just north of Minnesota, so a bit more of a stronger year in terms of tornadoes, as we did have the EF3 there, and then a couple tornadoes that hit the Mid Atlantic as well. So slightly more active, but still running a bit high, a little less compared to with 2015, where again it was kind of the same exact pattern. Now, 1972, though, despite it being a strong El Nino year, this one featured quite a bit of tornado activity, especially in Wisconsin and the extreme northeastern part of Illinois, where you had EF4 just north of Chicago, which is quite remarkable considering that, again, this is happening in September. which means, yeah, you may get that strong tornado in September as well. EF3 even happened here in northeastern parts of Mississippi as well, and even quite a few tornadoes around the coast. So a bit more of an active year. 2002 was even more active, with we had quite a bit of tornado activity in Wisconsin. Even Indiana saw a long-tracked EF3 tornado that moved through much of the state. This one, till still to this day, is recognized as the longest track tornado to hit the state. So definitely not something that a state wants to be known for, but unfortunately that did happen in 2002. And then finally, looking at 1986, also a very active year. Quite a few tornadoes splattered across the Midwest into Northeast. Keep in mind that this is 1986, so some of these tornadoes that occurred that year may have been unaccounted for, as back then tornado keeping records weren't as good as they are now. And even with surveyors nowadays, they're much more thorough with looking for those turtle tracks. So this number could have been very much higher, considering that there was a lot of splattering of tornadoes across much of the country during that year. But this does show us that the Midwest does get hit quite a bit in September. Even the Southeast, you do know some of those tracks around there. It does mean that they do also get some of the activity as well. So September does tend to be a bit. As we do head into October, you do notice the shift where all activity gets pushed down to eastern Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, with just a couple trails here in Iowa, but that's not really relevant. But you can tell that it gets the place a lot, especially with 2015. All that happened down in Deep South. Same thing with 1987, although a bit more active, as we had quite a bit of tornado activity occur across much of the southeast into deep south as well. Even some activity in the plains and parts of the Rockies. So a much more active year with a very strong El Nino component with it. And in 1972, despite it being a strong El Nino year, we did see quite a bit of activity across Texas, Alabama, Georgia, and even parts of Florida as well. So another active year overall of tornadoes. And then finally, 2009, another active year, especially in Arkansas, Kentucky, and Tennessee, as some of this activity did get displaced a bit to the north. Considering it's a moderate El Nino year, I'm not surprised, as this does tend to be a bit more sloppy in terms of where severe weather does tend to be during the course of the fall months. And of October, it's no different. It's show quite a bit active, especially in this region overall. Which is just telling that the South does typically see a lot more tornadoes in October as compared to anywhere else in the country. Now, November, this is when things get a little fuzzy, as with El Nino years, November tends to be very pick and choose in terms of where trails do occur, and along with severe weather too. Now, 2015 was kind of interesting, as with it being a very strong El Nino year, our activity was mainly here in Kansas, Oklahoma, Iowa. It was quite active in these areas, but not so much in the deep south. There were a few tornadoes, but it wasn't that much of active years. So this pattern was kind of reminiscent of what you would typically see in March, maybe even early April, kind of showing that pattern that was in place. So definitely not what you typically see in November. Now, with 1972, very active towards the south. A few EF2s, EF1 trains that occurred down there, but 1991 was a bit more active, especially towards Missouri and southern parts of Illinois. So a bit more of a strong activity stretching out towards these areas. It was the same thing in 1987, a bit active in this particular region of the country. Some EF3 tornadoes that occurred in parts of eastern Texas, so much more significant year for tornadoes. And then 1986, the year before that, also quite significant, with lots of tornadoes occurring in parts of the deep south into Florida. It was quite active that year. So this tells us that November does tend to be very active, especially across the south. Now we do have one more year to talk about, 2002. Now this one was a moderate El Nino year, but the problem this year is that there was one outbreak that kind of brought all this together, that being the Veterans Day outbreak, which did produce quite a bit of activity. So most of these scenarios you see on this map were from that one outbreak, but you can tell that it did affect the Deep South quite a bit. It also affected parts of the Midwest too. You can tell that it did hit eastern Indiana and Ohio pretty hard, with an EF4 tornado 2 in that picture. So definitely a significant outbreak, which just tells us that even the West may not be safe from these outbreaks. The plains may not even be safe, as again, Novembers tend to be very pick and choose with El Ninos in general. As we look towards our official severe weather outlook, starting off with September, unfortunately, not looking too good for Wisconsin as you guys are in the bullseye for severe weather. And I'm sure you guys are tired of hearing it as you dealt with it in April, May, June, July, and August. You name it. Unfortunately, you guys had a pretty bad severe weather season, and unfortunately, that does look to continue into September with a moderate risk for some severe weather at times, especially throughout the course of the month. So, looking at maybe quite a few slight risk days thrown in there, and maybe even a couple of enhanced risk days, especially early on in the month, as I do think that's where we're going to be the most active with this severe weather before it does kind of die down towards the latter end of the month. But the first half of the month looking especially active for this to occur, and then looking at surrounding areas from eastern Minnesota towards Kansas into Indiana into even the western parts of New York, looking at a slight chance for some severe weather being possible. So looking at maybe a couple slight risk days, maybe a, quite a few marginal risk days thrown in there. So looking quite active for you guys as well. And then around the coast of North Carolina, South Carolina, the southern parts of Florida, and even southeastern parts of Texas, I do think you guys will have some sort of tropical storm activity, which may try to brush near land or even try to make landfall. We could see that be the case, especially in those areas. So, looking at a slight chance for some severe weather in accordance to that during the month of September. Now, of October, there is some good news as you'll see the activity shift towards the south. We do notice that it does move down towards Oklahoma to Texas into parts of North Carolina, which is good news for a lot of the Midwest, as I'm sure you guys are waiting for those words. Yes, you guys will get a break in October, as it does mean the activity does shift back to the south, especially for Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama. You guys will be in that slight risk zone and then moderate risk zone from southeastern Texas into Florida, looking at increased risks for severe weather for you guys. So it does mean probably quite a few slight risk days, maybe an enhanced risk day thrown in there at some point in October. And in November, very active for the South. Look at this, up to extreme risk for Louisiana, and this is for a good reason, as despite the 6 years I did show you of the analogs of November, there were quite a few other years that showed the same exact signal, whether they were moderate, strong, or very strong. They all featured a lot of activity around Louisiana. So I do think this will be the area we're going to have quite a bit of severe weather occurring, maybe even a moderate risk day thrown in there at some point, as I do think it'll be quite active in this region throughout much of November, and not just for them, but also for areas in the high risk zone, looking at a lot of that being the case. And then the moderate risk zone goes into Arkansas, even into the southern parts of Missouri, and extending down towards Georgia. Could see quite a bit of activity as they progress throughout the month of November, and a slight risk going up towards Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, and even parts of South Carolina could see a slight increase in severe weather at times, and then even parts of southeastern Michigan, northeastern Indiana, and Ohio, because there were even, besides 2002, there were a couple other years that also featured severe weather in this portion of the country. So I do think there will be some sort of severe risk that will occur in this part of the country, maybe with a widespread severe weather outbreak, or even just with an isolated outbreak that has occurred in this region. So keep an eye on this region as we head throughout the course of November, as well as we have maybe 1, maybe 2 days of that occurring in that area. Now we finally move on to our hurricane outlook. I'm sure you guys are probably wondering what's going to happen with hurricanes this year. Well, there's some good news. As with hurricanes, they usually bring lesser impacts as we head throughout the course of the season. As unfortunately for hurricanes, El Nino is very famous for bringing a lot of strong wind shear, and wind shear is not good for hurricanes, as wind shear tends to rip them apart and keep them from maintaining their strength, which is good news considering that, again, it means that storms aren't able to actually hit land or impact areas. And along with that, And this means we're going to have a weaker Bermuda high pressure, which does sit in the Atlantic most of the time, but usually when it's strong, it can steer a hurricane right around it and have it hit in the U.S. Now, with it being weaker, it does mean that it will not be strong enough to push these hurricanes towards the U.S. Maybe even, let's say, we get a hurricane tracking towards Puerto Rico, it may turn sharply to the north and just avoid America altogether. That's how significant this piece of the puzzle is. As with a weaker Bermuda high, that's really good news for the U.S. Although again, you still have a system that does bypass this and end up still hitting the U.S. That can happen too with a Bermuda high as well. And even with that being the case, it does not mean or guarantee that hurricanes will not hit land, as unfortunately we saw the case where even when the hurricane's off the shore, it can still bring impacts, such as with Hurricane Joaquin in 2015 during a very strong El Nino year. This storm itself unfortunately sunk the ship off the coast and killed 34 people on board. So unfortunately, definitely an impactful hurricane. And even the caused record flooding in the Carolinas, as despite it not making its way towards land, it there was a low pressure system that was moving towards the coast, but at the same time, Joaquin was running towards the coast as well. And unfortunately, it did this effect where had the low sitting over the Carolinas for a long time and kept dropping rain on them for up to several days at a time. And unfortunately, it led to them breaking records with over 20, 30 inches of rainfall falling in that area, maybe even more. As I don't have the inches of rainfall off the top of my head, but it was quite a bit of rainfall to the point where it caused record flooding in those areas. And unfortunately, even despite Hurricane Joaquin being off land, it was retired, as unfortunately, with a secondary effect, it kind of led to flooding that occurred in the Carolinas. And then Hurricane Lily in 2002 was also quite impactful, made landfall in the Gulf as a Category 3 hurricane, causing $1 billion in damages. And this happened in the midst of a borderline high-end moderate El Nino event, maybe even bordering on a strong El Nino event, as it got really close but didn't quite meet the threshold, as it just missed the mark just by a little bit. But even then, this hurricane occurred in that year, which just tells us that again, even if we get a small break in those strong wind shear winds, that's where hurricanes can take advantage of and literally quickly develop and maybe even land. So this is just to let you know that despite it being El Nino, do not let your guard down, as any storm can still hit land at some point during the season, whether it happens in September, October, or November. It can still happen at any point. But that's pretty much it for this video. Thank you so much for tuning in to this video. I know it's a lot of information, definitely a lot to discuss. If you enjoyed this video and enjoy content like this, don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed it, and if you want to see more of this content, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to always get updated on whenever I post a video on this channel. Have a great day and stay weather aware.